Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. And welcome to all those who've made it through the snow and the ice. I have to say, if I wasn't presenting, I would be at home with everybody else. So the title, an undergraduate medical education, science, technology, or art ? I hope you don't expect me to answer by the end of the session, but we'll see how we get on. Okay, so a bit of biography. For most of my career, I was a consultant chest physician, respiratory medicine in Leicester. I did quite a lot of postgraduate education during that time, early on, and then I moved to take over the undergraduate clinical course at Leicester Medical School, now separate Leicester and Warwick medical schools. Well, gosh, over 20 years ago, I moved to Yorkshire to help set up the Hull York Medical School and its curriculum. And towards the end of my time there, I used that curriculum to help. Then I retired, but I was dragged back by Worcester to help them set up the Three Counties Medical School out of Worcester. And I'll say a bit about that later on. And then just as my term of office came to an end in Worcester, Portsmouth got hold of me and asked me to do the same thing in Portsmouth, which is what I've been doing for the past year. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Because medical schools are in universities, I think we need to talk about what universities are for. And in particular, should medical schools be in universities? Perhaps a bit controversial. I also want to say a bit about training and education and try and persuade you that those are quite different things, quite different words. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of medical schools. I'm going to say something about the curriculum and the stakeholders involved in creating a curriculum. Something about the funding. Any newspaper has a lot about the funding at the moment. Something about student selection. And then I'm going to finish off with a local perspective. So the question, is medicine a science, a technology, or an art? Hippocrates would have no doubt. Art is long, life is short. I think art, if for the Greeks, was a different entity to what we would now call an art, but more broadly based. Everybody knows that quotation. Art is long, life is short. They don't always know the rest. Opportunity is fleeting, judgment difficult, experience fallacious. Certainly true for medicine, and I would expect most biological sciences, and I suspect most other activity as well. So if we're going to talk about an undergraduate education, we need to consider what universities are for. And here are three possibilities. Nourishers of the mind, public service, economic drivers. And the first one is a view promulgated by Newman in his The Idea of University, and something we'd be familiar with, about evidence, weighing opposing views, debating, researching, publishing without fear or favor, and to do so as a community of scholars, staff, and students together. So that's one. There's another, rather opposite at the moment, certainly in medical education, because increasingly we're talking about the position of medical schools within their society, as rooted in the communities which they serve, and are socially accountable. Slightly different to Newman's idea of a great degree of independence. But there's another. And I'm quoting from Richard Horton, who in turn is quoting from the UK Academy of Medical Sciences. A few years ago, groundbreaking advances in medical science offer the next UK government, this is a few governments ago, you understand, the opportunity to reinvigorate the economy, to enhance the productivity of the NHS, and to make public services more cost-effective. And in his talk, Richard Horton goes on to castigate this view of accommodation, the type of education that we're getting into, the commodification of education, where things are measured in terms of money. But I like to think about what we do as scholarship. And I quote again Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet. I forgot to mention that earlier. And he's saying something very important, I think, about medicine, and indeed perhaps other areas of practice as well. So we're citizens of knowledge, inhabitants of the city of inquiry. And as doctors, we're scholars of the human body in health and disease. So we're critics of the world about us, of the social circumstance. We need freedom in scholarship. We need to nurture rational public decision-making, and we need to be free and independent. And we should have a compass that points us towards the truth they pursue and advocate relentlessly. Now, so some years ago, I showed this slide to a well-known vice chancellor, university vice chancellor, who said it was nonsense. So if you think it's nonsense, well, you're in good company. But nevertheless, I shall try and persuade you otherwise. So I'm drawing a parallel between universities on the one hand and medical schools on the other. Universities are largely interested in excellence. You won't go far in any online university site without hearing lots of excellence. And most courses will try, at least in part, to take their students to the cutting edge of the subject. And those subjects, that material is owned perhaps by an individual in a module, perhaps by a department, probably not higher than that. Universities hope that their graduates are employed, but they're not too worried about that. They like to tick the box, but it's not part of their main task. The placements, things outside the university, are optional, perhaps, and perhaps not terribly highly regarded. What goes on outside the campus is perhaps not quite right. They certainly prefer depth over breadth. And the assessment of the students is very largely by the individual, perhaps by the department, very much within the university house itself. Now, medical schools, and I would include, although I don't have any expertise in the area, I would include the other professional courses in this. We obviously like excellence, but actually we spend our time making sure that everybody has a basic competence. We need to make sure that our graduates can do the job. Everybody who comes out has to be able to do the job when they come out. If people are doing much better than that, that's fine, but we're not spending a lot of time on that. That's a bit different to universities who, once you've identified the first class honours people, they rather lose interest in the rest. We rarely go to the cutting edge of knowledge. There isn't time. And the course, which 20, 30 years ago would have been owned by departments, increasingly owned by the school because it's an integrated course, and increasingly, and I'll show you this later, by the General Medical Council, or perhaps really by the patients, because it's who turns up on the doorstep that ultimately decides what we do. Employability is pretty well guaranteed. though it is with a monopoly employer with the problems that that can create. And placements are the cause. More than half of a university undergraduate medical course is not in the university at all. It's not on the campus and it's not taught by university staff. It happens in health centres, in hospitals and elsewhere, and taught by people who are actually NHS employers. And we have to prefer breadth over depth. There's an awful lot of course stuff we have to get in. We can't go into detail in any great extent. That's postgraduate. And assessment, the exams, increasingly not provided for by the institution, but by elsewhere, which I'll mention later. And what that means for the university is, I think, something that hasn't been sufficiently debated, whether this outsourcing is actually correct. Now, don't read this, because you can't. But just a word about medical training, and this slide is to demonstrate that it's complex. So I'll show you something easier. So, many of you will be familiar, 5 years in university, at medical school, 2 years, a thing called foundation training, 3 years core training, 3 or 4 years specialty training, and then indefinite consultant. I'm not quite sure if that means forever or ill-defined. But anyway, so that's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years. So you're basically 34. Okay, and general practice is similar, but not quite the same. Just a few names, because I think people do get a bit confused about the sort of names we use. For years, we've used the term medical students. Not all patients know what that is, and sometimes people have used the term student doctor, but they're not doctors, so that doesn't quite do. Junior doctor does it, but you're still junior in your 30s. Trainee doctor perhaps does it, but in another way, we're all learners all the time. So you never stop being trained or educated. And the names that I was familiar with and grew up with, the various stages of training, house officer, SHO, and so on, have been changed to foundation year 1, 2, 3, core training and specialty training. So those are the sort of building blocks of it. But I'm just going to talk about the first 4 or 5 years in a medical school. I've mentioned training several times. It's different to education, and here's why. This picture on the left is taking blood from the patient. You're probably all, many of you are familiar with that. I can't do that anymore. I must have taken thousands of blood samples, but the technology has changed. It's now a one-handed job. For me, it was a two-handed job. So training goes out of date. You can train somebody, you can be trained, you can have the skill and carry on. You can train other people. But you can't change it, it's fixed. And if you want something new, you have to go back and start again, as I haven't done. So it goes out of date, and you remain passive learners. You remain in the situation you were when you trained. You may become more expert with practice, but you don't change fundamentally. So it enables people to follow a protocol, which is good. Protocols are good. Education, though, is quite different. It's a bit more difficult to represent a picture of education. But it's different because you can't be educated. You can educate yourself, and people can help you to educate yourself. We call that teaching, but you can only educate yourself. It's personal. And because it's personal, because you have changed yourself, it doesn't go out of date. And you can not only change yourself and continue to change yourself, but you can change other people. And by that way, become change agents. So it enables people to know when not to follow the protocol. And that's very important. Knowing when not to follow the protocol is important. Which is another way, people who are educated know what to do when they don't know what to do. You're probably familiar with that from other walks of life. Okay, I promised you some pictures of medical schools. I've got half a dozen here. Here's one. It's in London. You can tell that from the red bus. You can also see it's quite expensive to build that sort of thing. Here's another. Gower Street, I think you'll find this. Rather forbidding building, I think. You might expect Sir Lancelot Spratt to come out of the doorway anytime soon. Yes, if you laugh at that, you're young enough, you're old enough to know about Doctor in the House. This is a medical school. It's another picture of a medical school. It may look like a GP surgery, but it's actually a medical school. And that is because there should be a student just out of sight, or perhaps even occupying the swivel chair in the middle of the room. It's a medical school. This is a medical school. It may look like a football crowd, but it's also a population. A rather strange population, but nevertheless a population. And we deal quite a lot with populations. Why populations become ill, how they can prevent it from becoming ill, and what to do when they do become ill. And we need to do that very often on a population basis, because we can only understand the individual as part of a population. So that's the medical school. Top left may look like an NHS committee, but it's a medical school. Because the way we spend the health dollars to get the biggest bang for our bucks, for our tax bucks, is by having a process to do so. And if we're training the leaders for the future, some involvement in that kind of decision making is important. Though I've never met a student at that kind of committee, I have to say, and perhaps they should be. So by this time, you've got the idea, and you'll realize the bottom right picture is a medical school. But building a hospital just out of sight isn't going to help. This is about economists, sewage engineers, water engineers, politicians. The role of doctors is to point out to those people that to improve the health of the population does not need more doctors or more buildings. It needs other things. And that's an important part of the curriculum. Well, I'm still on pictures of medical school. This is another. It's got two components to it. It's got a seed and it's got some soil. The seed is the medical school. You can't see it because it's been dissolved. But it's situated in the health service. So the point is that the medical school by itself can't do much. A health service by itself can't do much. But if you put the two together, if you plant the medical school in the soil of the health service, you can actually grow a plant. You can grow more doctors. This is positively the last picture of a medical school. But it raises a question which I don't think we've begun to address, certainly in medicine, and I expect not elsewhere. What do we now do with our students when all of them carry the whole of human knowledge around with them in their pocket all the time? What's this say about what we teach? What's it say about what we assess? I don't know. I hope somebody somewhere is researching the issue. So there they are. So it's a medical school without walls. So although those nice shiny buildings that you saw early on are in one sense important, the rest of it is perhaps more relevant. That's the last picture of medical schools. Okay, on to stakeholders. There's lots of those. This is you can't read this, I know. Don't try, you'll strain your eyes. But there are a lot of stakeholders in the curriculum in the medical school, medical education. Well, that's not surprising. If you took any course, university course, there'd be a lot of content in it. The difference is that most of these have got a pressure group behind them. Somebody saying that this or that or t'other must be in the curriculum. And I think this picture in the middle is probably meant to be a student overwhelmed by the amount of knowledge they have to get hold of. But I think it's a dean of a medical school unable to cope with all the demands placed upon them and new things to put into the curriculum. Just to sort of take that a slight step further and to try and answer my question, I've highlighted here the things that you might call science. Not so many, but enough, yeah, good number. These are what you might call skills. A few of those. And these I'm not quite sure what you would call. They're perhaps social science, they're humanities, they're other bits and pieces. And I haven't highlighted all this on this slide, and I could produce a dozen slides, all with different things on. So it's a mixture. One of the main stakeholders is the GMC. The GMC is the reason why I do these jobs at Worcester and Portsmouth. The GMC provide a lot of guidance. It's more than guidance sometimes. And here's a picture of a few of the documents they produce, and there's many more. You go on the website, you'll find document after document of their suggestions, demands. And one of the main ones is a thing called outcomes for graduates. So these are learning outcomes produced by the GMC, which all medical schools have to sign up to and teach their students. I'm not sure what Newman would have thought of that. I don't think he'd be too impressed. But you might say, well, it's we're a century and a half on from Newman's book. I want to say a bit about what's in this document. That's not to criticize it, but just to point out that there are some interesting facets which you may or may not agree with. It has divided into 3 sections. They're professional values, professional skills, professional knowledge. So any education program is probably going to talk about knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So, okay, it's a fair division. In that, those sections, there are 26 subsections and 149 subsections. Took quite a long time to count those. And if we look at the subsections, all those, 56 are about values, 48 about skills, 45 about knowledge. Well, I don't know. Is that the way around? Perhaps it is. It's perhaps not what would have been predicted a number of years ago, but medicine has changed. If I take, and this does concern, and I think relevant to this audience, if we take number 22 out of the 26 subsections, this reads, and this is a common phraseology, newly qualified doctors must be able to apply biomedical scientific principles, methods, and knowledge to medical practice and integrate these to patient care. This must include principles and knowledge relating to every biomedical science. And in an established medical school, you probably have a department of each of these. I'm sort of very slightly troubled that only 1 out of 26 relates to all these topics. Now, of course, the number is not necessarily a reflection of what the course contains, but I think it's an interesting aspect that we sometimes struggle a bit with. Okay, so on to the money. It's expensive. It's about 40,000 per year, 200,000 for a course over 5 years, which is only half the cost of training a RAF pilot, incidentally. You get 2 doctors for every pilot. The student fees, as any parent will know, are £9,250. The office for students, because it's an expensive course, provides another 10k, but a good chunk of it comes not from down the education stream at all, but from the NHS. So about 20k, rather more actually, comes to play for the placements. So 40,000 in all. What do we do with it? Well, the bit that on the left goes to fund the university. Well, it funds the medical school, but sometimes it's top slice. Pays for building and equipment, staff, non-clinical staff, and some clinical staff as well. By clinical staff, I mean basically medically qualified doctors, who get paid more than university staff, as probably most people know. So the other half, the placement money, does everything else, or everything to do with placements, including administration, student issues, facilities, and in particular, the staff, the clinical staff, the doctors. Your GP, your consultant, is being paid separately, they don't see it separately, but it's part of the package, to teach as well as to look after patients. Okay, so that's the money. It might be useful to you when you read in the papers about the cost of medical training. Yes, it's expensive. Okay, so selection of students. Who gets in? There is a very large amount of literature on the topic. And I sometimes say when I'm asked, why don't we do whatever the questioner wants me to do? Why don't we do this? And I say, if we knew what to do, we would have done it longer, because the amount of evidence, there's plenty of stuff out there, but it doesn't actually tell us what to do. So I'm going to just run through a few things we might do, or do, or could do in selection, because by selecting somebody into a medical school, we're effectively producing or selecting for a doctor. The dropout rate is in medical courses is very low, something of the order of 5%. Sometimes we wish it was slightly higher, but it's low. Okay, so what do we do? Well, easy. We take the brightest. You know, it's competitive. You compete through the exams, through A-levels. People who come out top get places. Okay, been doing that for years. Looks okay. Looks objective. Some numbers we can use. Looks fair, and it does actually predict what we want. It's the best guide. A-levels are still the best guide to students both getting through the undergraduate course and passing the postgraduate exams as well. So it talks to the academic spine that runs through the whole of training over 20 years or so. But of course, you'll be thinking, well, that's all very well, but there's a lot of baggage behind it as to whether the influence of the school, the home, the type of school. These figures, I think, are a little out of date, but they show you something of the problem. So what could we do about that? Well, we could widen participation, WP, and all of us have been talking WP for years. And there's various ways of doing it, and I've listed a few here. You can go and choose postcodes, which postcodes only supply a small proportion of students to higher education. Non-selective schools, income, parents at university, children being in care or being carers themselves, and so on. You can do all that. This is a report from the Medical Schools Council. Again, it's getting old, a bit old, but I don't think it's changed very much. For many years, medical schools have put in place different measures designed to tackle the problem. Yes, we have indeed. None of these measures had any substantial impact on the number of students from a lower socioeconomic background studying medicine. It's at the margins. That's not to say we shouldn't try, but it's at the margins, or has been at the margins until unless we find differently. And I think really that perhaps medical schools are being asked to do something they can't do. They're being asked to level the playing field when the game is over. And that's not much help, really. But you may have your own views on that. Okay, what else could we do? Well, we could have a graduate-only entry. So you have to do a first degree, and that sets you up for a high-pressure course. And that's the pattern in the US and Canada. And many UK schools now offer a GEM, graduate entry medicine course, and a few are graduate entry medicine only. Who do you take into it? Well, it's a science-heavy course. So we take science graduates only. What would happen if we took humanities graduates as well? Well, if we do, and we have, they do okay, actually, which is interesting because it suggests that there are skills that humanities graduates have, which science graduates perhaps don't have. Perhaps some of the science graduates just a bit too much on the autistic spectrum. Certainly, graduates have more life experience, even if it's just 3 years at university. So that's one way. But it takes longer, of course. Someone's got to fork out for the first 3 years and then another 4 years, 7 years in all. So it's either the student or the parents or the state picking up the tab. And although you might think that graduates would do better, by and large, it's much the same. And that could be because many of the graduates we take in actually tried first time round, didn't make it. So they may not come with quite the same level as the school leavers with 3 A stars. And A-levels perhaps are good predictors even in graduate entry medical schools. Maybe we need to have some aptitude tests, see whether people are fit for the job. The classic psychological tests have not been terribly helpful, actually, which is a bit of a pity, but that's the case. So there are a number of aptitude tests. I won't go through them here. Many of them use SJT, situational judgment test, which puts the student in a situation and then asks them to make judgment about what to do. One of the problems is that sometimes examiners can't decide what to do. But if nothing else, it narrows the field. So if your school is overwhelmed by applicants, you can put them through a number of these things and top slice the results, and that gets your numbers down. There's probably more to it than that. But the jury is out, I think, on how well these things actually produce a different type of person. And that brings me to a dilemma, well, not a dilemma, but a contrast. For years, we've selected on academic merit. More recently, we've been saying, well, you know, medicine's so complicated. We need to think about other skills as well. So maybe we should select more on humanitarian qualities. Maybe we have somebody with less academic ability and more humanitarian qualities. Maybe it goes like a bit like this. Well, perhaps not. Interesting study here, quite recently. Intergrades, therefore, are predictors of exam performance. Now, we know that from what I've been saying. But also of being, or actually not being, sanctioned by the GMC and having ARCP problems. Now, those are both two measures of the softer skills, the non-examination skills, the personal qualities, the communication qualities, the working in teams qualities. So what we're saying, and these are, I would say, cohort effects. That's very important to remember, they're cohort effects, not individual effects. Individuals, of course, are as varied as they're on. But these are cohort effects. But if we're going to make decisions, we've got to make decisions on something. So maybe there is a common factor which determines both academic ability and humanitarian qualities, if we can put it like that. And there's been quite good evidence, I think, increasing evidence, that conscientiousness underpins these things. So if you are conscientious and you work hard and you do the work that's in front of you and you turn in your essays on time, you are also the sort of person who goes the extra mile with their patients and make sure that what they're doing is understood. People in my position remember a paper published a number of years ago, which looked at first-year medical students and who had to turn in a photograph of themselves to the faculty office. So they had to get a photograph of yourself and take it to the faculty office. So they timed how long it took people to get a photograph of themselves into the faculty office. They then looked at the academic results at the end of the first year. There was a close correlation. Some people are very surprised about that, but those of us in medical schools know quite believe that. In one of my schools, the assistant registrar in the medical school had worked it all out by the end of the first term, who was going to succeed and who was not. No other assessment was needed. Okay, so those are some ideas about selection. I'm going to finish with a plug, unashamed plug for your local medical school. The Three Counties Medical School, nothing to do with choirs or agricultural fairs, but nevertheless covering the same space. Out of Worcester, it's a 4-year graduate entry. I was working there for 4 years until this time last year. We may take, or they may take, the first students in September next year. But it's difficult because there is, as you've heard in the paper, no funding coming forward yet. But just a word about what it is. This is the Three Counties, and you can probably realize that there's Birmingham right at the top, which has a medical school. There's Bristol right at the bottom, which has a medical school. Oxford is out of sight to the east, and that has a medical school. And Cardiff is out to the west, and that has a medical school. So there's a bit of a hole here, a black hole of medical schools. The Three Counties is fine, it just lacks medical schools. Severe shortage of medical schools. And this is a map of Gloucestershire, which has the health services listed there, the hospitals, the centres, and so on and so forth. And Cirencester Hospital is down at the lower right, just there. and it's one of the places we would hope to use. So just a summary, it's a 4-year graduate entry, 45 weeks, no long vacs in graduate entry courses. We want to, of course, widen participation. We have to have a contingent partner in case the whole thing falls over. And we're using Swansea, who have a graduate course. We will plan, or we are planning, we have planned for early clinical exposure. So you might hope to see, expect to see at any rate, students when you visit your local general practitioner in the not too distant future. And we have an emphasis on primary care and psychiatry because they're the major shortage specialties at the moment. Though we do have to produce doctors, students who can enter any branch of the profession. Okay. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you're talking. So we've said something about what universities are for. I have some anxieties about the way it's going. I think they're becoming less independent in the search for uniformity. I'm not sure that's a good thing. Generally, I think medical schools should be in universities. I think it would be probably a difficulty if they moved to be in the health service, which has been promoted. I do think training and education are fundamentally different processes, and both are important. And both medical schools and health services need to recognize that there are those two dimensions. I've shown you lots of pictures of medical schools, which I think speak for themselves. The curriculum is difficult. Anybody who comes along and tells me they should, well, perhaps some of you will tell me what I can take out of a curriculum. I shall pump your hand with enthusiasm. I've said something about the funding, which will may help when reading the newspapers. You will all have your own individual ideas about selection, so I may hear about that. And I just pointed up a local perspective for you. Have I answered my question? Well, I think in some ways I've perhaps said it's complex, it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional, multi-system. But then I think anything that involves human beings, and when they're ill, is going to involve most aspects of life. So thank you.
Would you like to take any questions?
Yes, fine. Yes.
So I start off with one, and that is, we hear quite a lot about the shortage of doctors now and the shortage of nurses for that matter. Is there a way that the training process could be speeded up without, of course, sacrificing quality?
Yeah, quite a lot of people talk about that. A graduate entry school, in a sense, shorts it because it's 4 years rather than 5.
Yeah.
Some people have suggested it could be 3 years. I really think that's difficult. There is an enormous amount of stuff to be learned. And if you're expecting people to have the knowledge and skills to practice, it takes time. And I don't think it can be made more efficient. And that's because it's like a driving test. I think a driving test. Okay, you have an instructor with you, and you go out for a few weeks and you drive around and so on and so forth, and you get to know how it works, and you pass the test, and you sit the paper test as well, and you can then drive by yourself. Nobody can help you from that time onwards. To be a competent driver, an expert driver, requires you to be in the situation long term, meeting all those other conditions of traffic and weather and so on. Having somebody by the side of you may give you the odd hint or not, but they can't do much. It's experiential. That's certainly true, I think, for postgraduate training. And I think it's true for much of the of the undergraduate training. So I don't think you can shove stuff into people any faster than we do and get them out faster. And people are going to try, but I don't think it's going to work. What I'd love to do is set up a part-time medical school for people who have caring responsibilities, people who have to have a job, people who have young children, but it will take longer, not less time.
Whenever I go into a major hospital, I'm staggered by the number of different specializations that you see going down the corridors. And it strikes me that if somebody a student at an early stage wants to be a consultant in, say, audiology or a consultant in eyes, that you'd save yourself a massive cost and training, because he just does not need how to deal with a dodgy liver or how to deliver babies. If you concentrated, because by and large, if many of us here have been to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, you know, I think you should go to Swindon Hospital and get checked by the specialist. And I think there's a lot of possibility. Somebody that would like to specialize, not everyone would, but like to specialize early, you could cut back radically on cost and time.
It's been suggested, certainly, and some centres in the States have begun to do that. Personally, I would feel anxious about it. And that's, in fact, if anything, I think I would argue against it. And the reason, to explore that reason, it's between different silos, which is fine if you've got a single problem needing a single solution. And if you have that, you need the expert, well-trained, to do it. But increasingly, with an older population, increased frailty, most of the population that come to doctors, certainly with any particular problem, have got several problems. My father was a GP. He used to tell me, under 65, one diagnosis, over 65, at least three. And it's true. And I think there's a fair discussion in the profession that we don't look after the people with multiple pathology well. We divide them into specialists. Clinic for this, a clinic for that, a clinic for something else. They don't talk to each other because they don't know what goes on in the others.
No, but I'd still say, completely interrupted, but I would still, there still must be people who are trained across the board, and you do need the GPs, but the GPs are there to initially assess the multiple problems you may have, and they may send you up to have your knee checked, your eye checked, but it'll be by individual specialists that deal with individual parts. My wife's just had 2 new hips. You know, frankly, you don't need an eye specialist to give you a new hip. And I just think that if you recognize the fact that you need, that these specialists are needed much earlier, because what you're doing at the moment is saying, we're going to give you a general training for 5 or 6 years. And then, oh, by the way, would you like to learn about eyes? That's another 3 years. It's a waste of time and it's a waste of money. And it
seems to be.
Well, it seems to be.
Well,
I have to be corrected by my wife.
Well, well, 2 things really. One is that increasingly, as you probably know, we're using non-medical people, particularly nurses, but others as well, to do particular things, particular procedures. And that has been very successful. So your endoscopy, for example, may well be done by a nurse specialist, not by a gastroenterologist. And that seems fine, because if you do gastroscopy, if you do endoscopies every day, good heavens, you get pretty good at it, and you don't need to be know everything else. So I think that's starting. The other thing I think is that the general training you mentioned, as I was saying, doesn't go very far into any specialty detail. And certainly the courses I've been doing, I've rode back from trying to treat it as a series of specialists and thinking very much more about the generalities. So I construct a curricula around patient presentations, for example. So it's whether you've got chest pain or headache or back pain or rash or whatever, which can go in many different directions. And we don't have time to train people to be anything like a specialist ophthalmologist or whatever. It's just about the basics. And the other thing about it is that talking about the science, one of the things that doctors do, I think, probably other people don't. We know what to do and we don't know what to do. And that's because we do have that background training. We know how it all works. We know how it sometimes doesn't work. And we can work out from our basic knowledge what might be going on in this particular patient. So it's not just a question of pattern recognition, which is most of what we do. We can actually get beyond that and go behind to the underlying problem. You know, your ophthalmologist will spend his life seeing diabetics because your kidney doctor will spend his life seeing diabetics. Well, I don't know. Yeah, we do a bit of that. We do take nurses into medical courses, and debate I'm having this week actually. In fact, I was at a meeting earlier on about how to do that and whether they had enough science. And the arguments come back, well, perhaps they do, and even if they don't, they come with a whole lot of other stuff, which their science people don't have. So the answer is yes. I would certainly, as part of a part-time degree, like to take people who are currently working in NHS, physios, OTs, nurses, and keep them working, but at the same time give them time out to pursue a medical course. Now that, of course, is taking nurses away, but it is about employers looking after their staff and growing their staff in the ways that they can do so. So I think it's a positive thing for the staff.
There is apparently a course at Exeter where they, allowing paramedics in to do, degree course. Do you know anything about that and how successful it is?
Not that particular one. There is a course in Edinburgh, which is interesting, which is taking people who are working in the NHS. So they're working now in the NHS and put them through a part-time course. I think it's too early to know how it's going to work, but it's an interesting model.
I think the one in, if I may say, in Exeter, the first graduate came out as a doctor, okay, from starting his life as a paramedic, which is interesting, I think, because with quite a lot of experience, 10 years or 15 years.
I mean, there is this associate practitioner, associate physician course with which is a BSc, and there's quite a large number of them coming through. And this may answer some of your issues, because I don't know how these people will pan out, but I suspect that many of them will become really quite specialized in one small area and be very expert at that. But it's early days. Some of them, of course, will become doctors. They'll sort of change course.
I'm just going to say I'm a retired GP, and I was listening to what you're saying about specialising early, and I think the problem is that doctors need to have the bigger picture, even if you're, a very eminent surgeon, like say Moorfield and doing eyes and so on. It's the best doctors have the whole picture, and if you look at someone, you need to be able to assess things like their mental health, how ill they are. You were saying about diabetes and so on. If they're a very poorly controlled diabetic, but lots of other issues, and balancing all those things, aren't you, if you're a consultant?
Isn't that what the GP does?
Well, I think consultants make those decisions as well. I mean, you must have, as a chest physician, you would have, for example, working out that someone's depressed and looking at how that's.
Yes, quite a lot of patients in my chest clinic were depressed.
Sorry?
Quite a lot of patients in my chest clinic were depressed.
Exactly. Yes.
Sometimes I spotted it when the GP had. which was always.
I can say, John, that's when they first came in. They weren't impressed when they left.
Maybe that too. Yeah, but to take your surgeon, for example. Good surgeon knows how to operate. Better surgeon knows when to operate. Excellent surgeon knows when not to operate. And to know all those other bits about the patient other than the operation is a key skill.
Well, that's very well. I don't know if you read Henry Marsh's book, if you read his books, he talks a lot about when you should operate and when you definitely shouldn't.
Surgeons like operating. If somebody says don't operate, it's as well to take their advice.
My son-in-law teaches medicine consultant at Oxford University, and he is absolutely convinced that the competitive nature of medicine, especially at the level of Oxford and Cambridge, does not necessarily choose the right students. He is convinced, having seen students for 15, 20 years, that you need a broader education, and you don't need people that are brilliant. He has too many brilliant students who don't make good in the end.
Yeah, your admissions tutor is going to get letters from the local MP saying, why hasn't they taken this guy who's got 3-star A levels and absolutely brilliant, best student they've ever had in school? That's yeah.
John, I thought they'd done research on this some years ago, because you're exactly getting what you said about the C level and B level grades for A level made much better GPs because they were much more, they weren't nerdy and not on sort of maybe high functioning autistic levels or whatever, but were much more able to communicate with people and
Well, it may be, but that evidence I showed you towards the end sort of questions that a bit, but there may be a common denominator for those two things. I never thought it likely that people who were very bright would necessarily lack the humanity aspect.
The person you found in our year, which was the Boris Johnson of medicine, he was winged everything.
You know,
You just sort of knew that he was going to do what he didn't get through.
At least I may say we don't have Boris Johnson as a doctor. Any other questions? John.
Yes. 50 odd years ago, when I was up at University of Southampton, it started a medical school, and I recall that the unique feature of that was that it would allow walking of the wards from the outset, and not do what was then the classic 3 years.
2 plus 3.
Yeah. Now, bearing in mind what you've been talking about, do you have a view on whether that was actually a progressive or a retrogressive scheme?
Oh, progressive. And we've done it since. Every medical school now will at least claim to introduce their students very early on to clinical practice. It's been a big difference.
Has it made for better doctors?
You know, that's very difficult. How would you judge? And one way you would judge is, do the patients get better? But yeah, try the experiment. I don't think we can.
That depends on your cohorts, doesn't it?
Yeah, the GMC actually, to give them justice, are running a thing called UK Med, which took 5 years to set it up, but they are following students from entry to medical school all the way through into practice. So that will produce quite a lot of very interesting data, I think, about what does and does not. But even so, it's the cohort effect. You know, you can describe what a cohort does, but maybe individuals who are quite different.
Right. Well, now thank you very much, John, for a fascinating talk. A subject that is, I think, near to us all, you know, as we battle, and the country battles health and adequate experts to deal with all our increasing problems. Thank you very much for that. Great to have you with us this evening. Thank you very much.